Hey everyone, while I was editing this, it became clear that you, as the listeners, would be missing some context on topics I discussed if you didn't listen to part 1 of the series. So if you haven't, I would highly recommend that you pause this episode and go listen to the first one, then come back to this one. Now, on to the show. Welcome to the Intrusions Indepth podcast. This is Josh Stepp. This is the second episode of a multi-part series in which we dive into the cyber attacks of Phineas Fisher and expand the aperture to analyze the actions of the victims involved. This is a tale of political activism, moral ambiguity, and the daring actions of one or many hackers who dare to confront the powerful and some would argue corrupt actors in our world today. Join me as we dive into the world of Phineas Fisher and Hacking Team. But before we do that, let's not get sued.
The information presented in this show is sourced from publicly available materials and does not contain any classified or proprietary content. The views and opinions expressed are those of the host and guests alone and do not reflect the official policy or position of their employers or any affiliated organizations. Enjoy the show.
Now, when it comes to hacktivism, there are a few names that stand out more than Phineas Fisher. This enigmatic figure burst onto the scene in 2014 with a series of high-profile attacks targeting organizations accused of enabling government surveillance. See episode 1 for the first attack on Gamma Group. Phineas Fisher's most notorious hack was the 2015 breach of Hacking Team, an Italian company that sold spyware, surveillance tools, to governments and law enforcement agencies worldwide, including authoritarian regimes with troubling human rights records. By exploiting the vulnerabilities in Hacking Team systems, Phineas managed to exfil a massive trove of internal data, over 400 gigabytes worth of emails, client lists, source code, video files, and more. Now, the Hacking Team leak was a bombshell. It exposed the company's shady dealings and sparked a global conversation about the ethics of the surveillance industry in general. While organizations like Citizen Lab had been publishing reports about the commercialization of offensive tools, Phineas Fisher pushed the discussion to newspapers and media outlets, a broader audience. It cemented Phineas Fisher's reputation as a skilled attacker with a moral compass, someone willing to take great personal risk to shine a light on what they saw as injustice and abuse of power. Let's take a closer look at Hacking Team, the target that put Phineas Fisher on the map. Founded in 2003 by Italian programmers David Vincinetti and Valerina Biscesci, I apologize if I mispronounced that. Hacking Team started out as a cybersecurity firm, but they quickly pivoted to a more lucrative and controversial business model, selling offensive tools to government and law enforcement. As a slight tangent, there was conflicting information on the origins of Hacking Team in my research. It doesn't change the story, but in an effort to be as factual as possible, I feel like I need to cover it. David Vincinetti was the CEO of Hacking Team and kind of served as the Hacking Team's main individual or the face of Hacking Team. And they were criticized a lot post-leak of their emails by Phineas Fisher, which we're going to cover a lot. Now, David Vincinetti is an interesting character in this story. According to the book Pegasus by Laurent Richard and Sandrine Rygard, apologies if I mispronounced that, he was a flashy guy that drove around in exotic cars, wore expensive suits, and let people know that he was rich. I believe the technical term for this is called balling out of control. Probably something like tech bro CEO status. Now, having had success at other cybersecurity firms all before the age of 35, he had somewhat of a following in the community. People often commented that Hacking Team devs weren't employees, but followers. Their software had been credited with taking down mafia bosses and helping stop human trafficking of Mexican women. That's something I would be proud of. It's good stuff. But like all heroes, eventually they turn out to be human. As F. Scott Fitzgerald, author of The Great Gatsby, once quoted, "Show me the hero and I'll write you the tragedy." We'll get there shortly. 3 other individuals are credited with founding or being part of early Hacking Team, according to an article by The Verge. I've linked it as well. Albert Orneghi, aka Alga, and Marco Valeri, possibly 2 of the co-founders of Hacking Team, or at least early employees, were also the original developers of Ettercap. They created Ettercap as a network security analyst or penetration testing tool, which gained significant popularity in the community. However, Italian police departments also wanted to use it to spy on their citizens. Another individual, Christian Ponzi, aka Naga or Nega, was also a key player in hacking team and had some involvement in the development of Ettercap as well, potentially. This isn't really clear. As I'll cover later, Ponzi is the assistant man at hacking team that kind of assumed one of the villain roles. I guess lying on Twitter about what your company does is frowned upon. Shocker. Like I said, it doesn't really matter to the origin story of Hacking Team. It isn't the core focus of this podcast, but I just wanted to highlight that it appears Hacking Team formed after an open source project got a lot of attraction from the market. And thus the developers saw that they could make a business out of this open source project, which is a common story in tech. Now back to Hacking Team. Hacking Team's flagship product was a piece of malware software called Remote Control System, or RCS, or DaVinci, or Galileo. I'll just be calling it RCS. Once installed on a target's device, RCS could secretly record keystrokes, intercept emails and instant messages, remotely activate microphones and cameras, and a lot more. It was a spy's dream come true, or a stalker, or an oppressive regime. Just saying. The company marketed RCS as a lawful interception tool, something that could help authorities combat terrorism, organized crime, and other threats. But it didn't take long for human rights groups and privacy advocates to raise alarms about the potential for abuse. We'll cover some of that in a bit. Furthermore, Hacking Team made some more strategic moves by opening offices in Annapolis, Maryland, the United States. They were trying to get in a position to lobby U.S. intelligence and law enforcement agencies. As Hacking Team's client list grew to include countries like Ethiopia, Bahrain, Egypt, Kazakhstan, and Sudan, places not exactly known for their commitment to civil liberties, those concerns only intensified. There was evidence that Hacking Team's tools had been used to spy on journalists, activists, and political dissidents, not just criminals and terrorists. Now let's take a look at some of the reporting on Hacking Team's customers and talk through what it means. The first article I want to talk about is a Wired magazine article titled "American Gets Targeted by Digital Spy Tool Sold to Foreign Governments" by Kim Zetter. Now, this article was about an American woman being targeted by the Turkish government as being possibly linked to the Gulen movement, or Gulen movement. I looked up how to say this online, but there's multiple different ways to pronounce it, so I apologize if I'm mispronouncing it as well. According to the article, this woman received a suspicious email claiming to be from a Harvard professor, but the email address was misspelled hardward.edu. It was a phishing email. Anyway, this email contained a link to a website in Turkey hosting a malicious downloader file. The woman, wisely suspicious, forwarded the email to researchers at Arsenal Consulting. They set up a honeypot, visited the site, and obtained the downloader for analysis. This probably felt like Christmas to them. Now, here's where it gets interesting. The downloader file was identified to be part of RCS sold by Hacking Team. The researchers couldn't definitively prove who was behind the attempted attack. However, since Hacking Team only sells to governments, and given the relationship between the Gulen movement and the Turkish government, one could connect those dots. Now, if Turkish authorities were indeed responsible, it would mean that a NATO ally tried to spy on a U.S. citizen on U.S. soil, likely without the knowledge or approval of the U.S. government. That's not cool. I mean, Snowden did allege that Chancellor Merkel's phone had been spied on since 2010, so maybe that sort of thing is common. I doubt it, and I don't know how accurate that is either. Now, just to add context, as I'm not really a Turkey or Turkish politics or Gulen movement source of truth by any means, I did a little bit of research and dug deeper. Now, the Gulen movement is led by a guy named Fethullah Gulen from his Pennsylvania compound here in the United States. The movement has or had a large following in Turkey, and they claim to promote dialogue between different religions while focusing on quality education. As such, they have multiple schools around the world. There's also a brief history between the AKP party and Gulen being allies, and then there being some sort of split. I'll cover a lot of that in the next episode when I talk about the AKP party a little bit more. And then the Turkish government, particularly under the leadership of Erdogan, views the Gulen movement as a threat. Now, that obviously wasn't always the case, but it's kind of what it's seen in recent history. Now, with influence in the state institutions, police, court systems, military, concerns about a parallel state emerged. Then, in July 2016, there was a failed coup on President Erdogan. He blamed the Gulen movement and made a new designation for the group, FETA, Fethullah Terrorist Organization. Now, following the coup attempt, the Turkish government launched a massive purge against the movement. They arrested thousands of people, shut down schools and media outlets associated with the movement, and seized assets. Many followers were dismissed from public service positions, and there was widespread crackdown on civil society associated with the movement. As a note, I've seen some allegations that the coup was staged as a way to remove these people from power, kind of like a false flag type of event. I don't have any insight on how true that is or even how I would prove it. And just wanted to add it for transparency to paint a better picture, see both sides of it. In another article, this time by CBS News, ahead of Secretary of State's Rex Tillerson's visit to Turkey, prior employees of the U.S.-based Gulen charter schools alleged that the schools are abusing the charter school system as a way to use taxpayer funds in America to fund the movement back home in Turkey. According to CBS News, they have 136 schools in 28 states operating on more than $2.1 billion. There were also allegations that the school demanded Turkish employees pay kickbacks and asked for that in cash. Seems fishy. I guess the response to those allegations was that they were donations, but I think we can all agree that forced donations aren't really ethical and aren't really donations. The last data point on the Gulen movement that I wanted to add was also from the CBS News reporting. According to the article, federal investigators believe that there are allegations of school officials in Ohio paying themselves about $5 million in federal contracts and then sending those funds back to Turkey to a bank that's linked with the movement. I'll link the article in the show notes, but let's get back to Hacking Team. So the original problem set that we're seeing here is that commercial grade malware was being used on a US citizen by a NATO member. So first, did Hacking Team do anything wrong here? Besides building commercial grade malware, I can't really think of much. Turkey is a NATO country. If you can't sell arms, cyber weapons, I just wanted to say that, to NATO countries because we are afraid of abuses, that's a high bar, one that I doubt others are held to. Other contractors are allowed to sell to NATO countries, and particularly Turkey as well. Now, if what is written is true, isn't this the Turkish government's fault? For sure. But that's not the case of Hacking Team selling to people they weren't supposed to. They claimed that they were selling it to government and law enforcement people, not on sanctioned lists, which appears to be the case here. Let's go to another example. Hacking Team also had connections to Mexican drug cartels. In the book Pegasus, that I mentioned earlier, they highlight an account of training and support given to Mexico's Department of Urban Development. The Hacking Team employee tasked with this knew that the department didn't have lawful intercept jurisdiction. But he also put the pieces together that this wasn't government officials, but rather members of the Los Zetas cartel in Mexico. As it turns out, those members of the Los Zetas were tasked with spying on the government's opposition, allegedly. And that Hacking Team member, realizing that this wasn't a good situation, resigned. And at the time, Mexico was the largest customer of Hacking Team. All right, so this instance is a little more nuanced. If the cartels were also being called members of the government, that's a Mexico problem to an extent, and hard for Hacking Team to know. Sure, we can say that Hacking Team should vet this immediately and stop the training and support once they were notified. It doesn't appear that happened according to the book. They're also a cash-hungry startup, so I would imagine that influenced their decisions, as well as rumors of other parts of the Mexican government trying out the NSO Group's software. The book also documented how U.S. agencies also dipped their toes in the purchase of Hacking Team software. The details for the FBI and DoD are scarce, but according to the Pegasus book, they both had contracts in addition to the DEA's contract for $2.4 million. So by all accounts, the primary customers in which Hacking Team reported to target. There aren't really details on those targets either, so is this just another case of lawful but potentially awful? That's tough. Putting the burden on companies not to supply a demand in a capitalist system doesn't feel logical in my opinion. And I'm not bashing capitalism. I like food too much to be a communist.
Oof.
So this leaves you in a position where you can have lawmakers ban the use of technology except under specific conditions, which could be problematic. If the law says you can only use them on people classified as a terrorist, well, you can just classify everyone as a terrorist. Hopefully there's a solid definition for terrorists in the law, but I think we get the point here. Or you can just use your influence and buying power to say that you, in this case hacking team, have to follow these rules or guidelines as an outline in something like the Wassenaar Agreement. I know there's issues with the agreement that hurts malware research. I just needed an example. Now, if hacking team didn't follow these rules, the collective of countries that do will sanction them, and thus they would be missing out on large swaths of business. The idea is that business is also more safe and you make more money by dealing with the good guys, quote unquote. Now, do you think an Iranian court is going to force the IRGC to pay a bill that they stiffed hacking team? I doubt it. What about a Russian court? I don't even know if North Korea has courts, but I feel like a good way to end your bloodline is to rule against the supreme leader. So at least by dealing with the more friendly, more economic countries, more democratic countries, you at least will get paid. Now let's talk about Saudi Arabia and David Vincenetti's Hail Mary pivot. As with most things the past 20 years or so in information security, there's a bit of geopolitics mixed in. And in case you're wondering, I'm going to talk about some religion stuff as well, so that should get a sufficient number of people angry. Now, President Obama took a different stance than most presidents did at the time. His administration was more open to negotiations with Iran, specifically about their nuclear program. This was met with a lot of criticism from longstanding allies in the Middle East, particularly Saudi Arabia and Israel. With Saudi Arabia and Iran, it's a mixture of conflicts, with the most prominent being the Shia and Sunni religious beef. This is way worse than any Kendrick-Drake diss tracks, although rap battles to solve disputes could be fun and way less deadly. What if...
Yo, it's the Sunni side, we reign supreme. From the deserts of Riyadh to the oil fields gleam. With the heart of Islam, Mecca's our crown. Pilgrims flock in millions, bowing down. Iran's nuclear dreams, we ain't having that. We're the guardians of peace, and that's a fact. Proxy wars in Yemen, we got our boys. Backing up the cause, silence the noise. Persians and Arabs, historical clash. But we rise above, got the oil cash. Superpower dreams with the Middle East kings. Sunni pride forever, hear the anthem we sing.
And then 2 weeks later, this gem would drop from the Iranian side.
From Tehran to the Gulf, Shia pride we shout. Persian empires boost there, no doubt. Back in proxies, yeah, we play the game. Yemen's our stage, they remember our name. Nuclear ambition, just a means to be strong. Defend our nation, we've been oppressed too long. Arabs and Persians, the history's thick, but we're shaping the future. It's no quick fix. Oil's in the mix, power's our aim. Superpower status is more than just fame. Sheer resilience, we're here to stay. Iran's rising high, carving our own way.
Okay, I've been an idiot, and this is supposed to be a serious podcast. Obviously, this is meant to be a joke about rap battles, and I'm not bashing anyone's religion or any other viewpoints. Like I said, there's some Shia and Sunni elements there. Additionally, both countries want to be seen as like a superpower in the Middle East. They back proxies fighting in places like Yemen, and there's an oil component to it as well. Saudi Arabia isn't too excited about a nuclear Iran, and there's a long-standing historical angst between the Persians and Arabs. Now, I'm not really doing this any justice, and just consider this a very abbreviated summary. You could do better than me and find better information on YouTube. I'll make a frontline video series that is way better than anything I could do. Now, Saudi Arabia, on the other hand, has been considered an ally or friend of the United States, although these days the relationship between Western world leaders and MBS isn't as strong. But at the time, Saudi Arabia bought a buttload of weapons from the United States and saw this newfound relationship with Iran troubling. And they still buy weapons, just to this day. Israel also had an opinion of this new friendship with Iran. Israel is considered to be the United States' strongest ally in the Middle East. They get tons of foreign aid and is basically a Western-style state in the Middle East. Western being that both men and women have similar rights to those in Western countries, like the United States. Like I said, this is a broad overview. I know it's not a one-for-one comparison, and there's aspects of Israel being technically a secular state, although they seem to be fine with other religions practicing there. At least from my short time there, I didn't see anything that would contradict that. Now, if you were traveling from a city in the United States, Tel Aviv wouldn't be a culture shock to you. Now, Israel obviously wasn't excited about Iran talks with the United States either. I think it's fairly clear these days why that is. So where does Hacking Team fit into this? Well, David Vincennetti gambled that Saudi Arabia would want their own tool for the fifth domain of war, the cyber domain. This wasn't a bad business decision. Ethically, it's pretty suspect, but it's probably good for business. The Saudis have a lot of money, and they probably need this capability. Israel already had their own well-funded startup in this space, NSO Group with their Pegasus implant. So Hacking Team setting up a deal to sell a portion of the company in exchange to being the premier supplier to the Saudis is kind of a win-win. It also helps sweeten the deal that Saudi Arabia's largest company, Saudi Aramco, had just been cyber attacked by Iran, allegedly. Ultimately, the deal fell through, though. Now, in an effort to speed things up, I want to briefly talk about the abuses in Sudan. But like all things geopolitics, it's complicated, but Hacking Team's involvement isn't so much. Sudan was embargoed over the Darfur conflict, or the Darfur genocide. Basically, they were put on a list of countries you shouldn't sell arms to because they're abusing the human rights of citizens, killing a bunch of people, and forcing a large number of refugees to Chad and other countries nearby. Terrible, bad stuff. I think we can all agree. Now, it was suspected to be the case, but was difficult to prove until it was confirmed via dumped emails by Phineas Fisher. That's not a spoiler. You know something bad happens to them. That's why I'm talking about them. So this is a pretty obvious case of Hacking Team violating embargoes. Now I want to wrap up the Hacking Team customer profile and allegations by going to the UAE, United Arab Emirates. Another instance of Hacking Team's RCS being used to squash dissent was against UAE democracy activists. The victim was Ahmed Mansour, a pro-democracy activist in the United Arab Emirates. He received an email with a Microsoft Word attachment labeled "Very Important" in Arabic. Thinking it was from a trusted contact, he clicked the file. Big mistake. That single click unleashed powerful spyware that exploited a flaw in the Microsoft Word within the Microsoft Office suite of tools. It allowed the hacker to completely take over his computer, record every keystroke, and access all his personal emails. They even maintained persistence after he changed his passwords. But the cyber attack was just the beginning of his nightmares. In the following months, he was physically assaulted twice by unknown assailants, landing him in the hospital with injuries. Coincidence? He thinks not. So who is behind this vicious campaign? Well, researchers at Citizen Lab traced the spyware back to Hacking Team. The researchers couldn't conclusively prove that Hacking Team sold the spyware, or who they did to in this case, but all signs point to the UAE government. Mansour had been a vocal critic of the regime, even serving prison time for his activism. And he's not the only dissident in the country who's been targeted with similar cyber attacks. But back to the original question, did Hacking Team violate any laws or treaties or trades lists? Not to mention, UAE is an odd case, if you think about it for a moment. There's a U.S. Air Force base and naval base there that were used to fight ISIS or ISIL in their heyday. But there's also allegations of Chinese bases being built in the area. So while it isn't clear that these tools enabled or facilitated people to find Mansour or assault him, it's damning to say the least. Let's look at some of the technical details of this campaign thanks to Morgan Marquise BR from Citizens Lab's report titled "Backdoors Are Forever, Hacking Team and the Targeting of Dissent?" Now, the initial entry was via a malicious email attachment in the form of an RTF document, or rich text format file. A type of Word document that had a nasty little surprise. Let's quote from the report. This document exploits a stack-based buffer overflow in the RTF file format that has been previously characterized as a stack-based buffer overflow in Microsoft Office XP SP3, Office SP3, Office 2007 SP2, and Office 2010, Office 2004, and 2008. for Mac that allows remote attackers to execute arbitrary code via crafted RTF data, aka stack buffer overflow vulnerability, end quote. When Mansour opened the document, he grew suspicious of the text as it was presented in a distorted and incoherent way. His email account was accessed later over the course of 3 days by 3 IP addresses originating from the UAE. Analysis of the lore document, titled veryimportant.doc, revealed that it was a downloader for the second stage of malware reaching out to a host, ar-24.com. The second stage was called veryimportant.doc2, which was also a downloader reaching out to the same domain to pull out the very cleverly named Stage 3, the implant or backdoor called veryimportant.doc3. Veryimportant.doc3 writes numerous files to disk. They're all a bunch of weird letters and names, so I'm not going to randomly read out a bunch of letters and names into the microphone. After those files are ran, multiple processes were infected. Explorer.exe, being the process responsible for the GUI interacting with files, iExplorer.exe, the Internet Explorer browser, WSCNTFY.exe, or Windows Security Center notification, it's a background process responsible for displaying security alerts and notifications to the user, ReaderSL.exe, being a process with Adobe Acrobat Reader for PDFs, and VMwareUser.exe, a process associated with VMware tools that is possibly being targeted to copy clipboard items or D&D/drag and drop files. Now, modules were also loaded into those infected processes. Furthermore, memory analysis revealed that the malware hooked numerous functions to facilitate the spying. This implant did a lot of actions on disk. It also went the YOLO and memory route and marked the infected code as read-write-execute. Having all 3 marked can be a flag. Modern security solutions monitor for these functions and use this as a way to alert for possible process injecting. So attackers typically try to misuse libraries that already have those permissions. Moving on, persistence is established via a run key in the registry. Nothing novel here. However, analysis of the strings revealed several anti-rootkit and antivirus software names, suggesting a level of defense evasion. There was also strings analysis that was conducted for popular browsers, Chrome, Internet Explorer, Opera, Firefox. In addition to that, the strings also suggested capability of infecting VMware virtual machines. Now, the Windows implant included the signed AMD 64 driver. The certificate was issued by VeriSign to OPM Security Corporation. OPM Security Corporation was a Panama-based company at the time. So I guess hacking team learned that signing their own stuff like Gamma Group kind of gives up the trick. The C2 server wasn't so obfuscated. The domain ar24.com was registered through GoDaddy and pointed to a server 50.116.38.37. However, for a short period of time, it pointed to 83.111.56.188, which was also the time of the attack. Domain records for that indicated address had the address on record as PO Box 5151 Abu Dhabi, UAE. This address is also the corporate headquarters of Royal Group, which is a collective of companies based in the UAE. Moreover, a sample on VirusTotal titled veryimportant.doc was discovered with structurally very similar aspects, and the C2 for that sample was rcs/demo.hackingteam.it. In essence, I guess they didn't really train them on how to change the name of the implant. According to promotional materials, RCS used zero-day exploits as a way to gain entry. Now, I want to quote from the Citizen Lab report, as the next portion of sleuthing is impressive, and I can't do it justice. An additional sample with structural similarities to the first and second stages were discovered in VirusTotal. This sample used an exploit that has similarities in shellcode with veryimportant.doc. However, the exploit it uses is a newer Adobe Flash Player Matrix 3D integer overflow. Searching for the origins of this exploit revealed a public mailing list post taking credit for discovery of this bug, stating, "This vulnerability was discovered by Nicolas Jolet of Vupin Security," end quote. Vupin was a French security company who provided a variety of services, including the sale of, quote, extremely sophisticated and government-grade exploits, specifically designed for offensive missions. They claim to have discovered the vulnerability in January of 2012, and they shared this with their customers prior to their disclosure publicly in August of 2012. The sample analyzed by Citizen Lab is right in the middle of that, May of 2012, prior to the public disclosure. While Vupin took public credit for the discovery of the bug, it is possible that the exploit used here was not written by Vupin, but was independently discovered and weaponized by another party, end quote. So as we can see here, the evidence against this being the UAE government or UAE higher-ups using hacking team software to spy on an activist appears to be strong. Now, the line between activists and terrorists gets fuzzy sometimes. Now, moving on, I want to discuss the fingerprinting and particularly where the servers were for Hacking Team and where they had been found. Now, Hacking Team used a series of proxy chains that sometimes went to data centers in the United States. These proxy chains, or circuits, would hide the true operator of RCS. For example, a victim may see their computer sending data to California, but not know that ultimately that data was going back to the government of Sudan, or UAE, or Egypt. Now, Citizen Lab brings up legal concerns of wiretapping and violation of other countries' laws in doing this practice. Quote, the extensive and deliberate use of dedicated U.S. hosting companies by foreign countries' wiretapping activities raise a number of pressing legal and policy concerns. These include whether RCS client countries violate U.S. law and longstanding international legal principles on sovereignty and non-intervention through the use of spyware. Moreover, RCS client countries, by exposing wiretap data to U.S. and other jurisdictions, may have violated internal laws governing the safeguarding of wiretap material. End quote. Citizen Lab was also fingerprinting these servers based on responses from HTTP GET requests. The method revealed RCS servers being used in 21 countries: Azerbaijan, Colombia, Egypt, Ethiopia, Hungary, Italy, Kazakhstan, Korea, Malaysia, Mexico, Morocco, Nigeria, Oman, Panama, Poland, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, Thailand, Turkey, UAE, and Uzbekistan. Now, 9 of those countries received the lowest rank of authoritarian in the Economist's 2010 Democracy Index. Additionally, 2 of those users, Egypt and Turkey, have brutally repressed recent protest movements. And Azerbaijan is probably on the list as well, because they were able to determine the winner of a democratically elected leader before the voting had begun. That's impressive stuff. And highly corrupt, if you didn't get the joke. Now, we could dive into mobile implants and the evidence for that, like loading a file called rcs.apk on the Android samples, but the functionality is largely the same as I went over in the previous episode with Gamma Group. Essentially, it tracked calls, provided location data, stooped on SMS and MMS. It's nothing really revolutionary, to be honest. Well, that is until July 5th, 2015. At 3:15 a.m. Italian time, an odd tweet appeared from the largely dormant Twitter account of Hacking Team. Since we have nothing to hide, we're publishing our source code, emails, and files. Hacking Team and their Twitter account had been hacked. And guess who claimed responsibility?
It's Phineas Fisher, yeah, I'm back in the scene. A hacker on a mission, disrupting the machine. Hacking Team took him down with finesse. For the rules and the truth, man, you know I confess. Read the Citizen Lab, saw the messed up report. Fisher and the others, just a crooked cohort. I don't do it for the fame, not for the glory. Just to give the targets a break, that's my story. Anti-surveillance, yeah, that's my fight. Exposing all of that darkness, bringing it to light. Surveillance companies got no morals, it's true. But I'm addicted to the pulse, just like them two targets in Bahrain.
Now, as with the attack on Gamma Group that I detailed in the previous episode, Phineas Fisher didn't just expose Hacking Team's misdeeds. They also wrote a guide on how they did it, a manifesto of sorts that served as both a technical manual and a call to arms for fellow hacktivists. Also, they just stole Hacking Team's Twitter this time, and they didn't need to set up a Hacking Team PR troll account. Like I said in a previous episode, these types of insights are incredibly rare to see, especially from this side of the keyboard. Sure, you get pen test reports when you pay someone to do this, but doing it this way, there's no scope, there's no predefined targets. It's a free-for-all. It's not great for production, but it's a free-for-all, and you get to see your true weaknesses. These were extremely valuable to me as I was still early in my information security career. Speaking of being early in my career, I often felt like I didn't know enough or that technology was changing too fast to keep up. I always wish I had more mentors or experts in the field to ask questions and maybe hear their journey of where they are now. Well, I had to suffer, but you don't. The Stats on Stats podcast, hosted by my friends Jordan and Tiffany, has your back. I enjoy listening to every episode and hearing how other tech professionals got into tech. Some of my favorites include Episode 4 with Josie Coles, Episode 8 with Bertram Madison, and Episode 11 with Shaniqua Burks. So when you're done listening here, give them a listen on YouTube at Stats on Stats Podcast or at their website, statsonstats.io. Back to Phineas Fisher and Hacking Team. This guide was titled Hack Back, a DIY guide with ASCII art and an image of a frog urinating on the letters HT. It's for Hacking Team. And it described the hack. It was also written in Spanish, but being that I'm barely able to communicate in English, I used a translation. It's linked in the show notes. Being that this guide was written in Spanish, this time, we can glean a bit more information about who Phineas Fisher is. Now, I'm not interested in trying to uncover that to be completely transparent, but maybe it explains some of the future attacks. And from what I can tell, it's fluent Spanish. In other words, this doesn't seem to be in the opinions of others that Phineas Fisher is attempting to masquerade as a Spanish speaker. Similar to how it is believed that the Russians tried to cosplay Romanians with the Gucci for Two entity. There was also document metadata that kind of blew that cover as well. Now this guide, or manifesto, opened with a pointed critique of the state of hacker culture, especially in the English-speaking world. Phineas Fisher argues that while there's no shortage of skilled hackers out there, that too many of them have been co-opted by the very institutions that they should be fighting against: defense contractors, intelligence agencies, banks, and corporations. In Phineas's view, these hackers might still wear the trappings of the rebel, the t-shirts, the blue hair, the hacker handles, but they sacrifice the counterculture spirit that birthed the scene in the first place. They become tools of the status quo, not threats to it. Now, right off the bat, this guide is different than the one for Gamma Group. There's more personality, more opinions sprinkled in, which, if you're going to cosplay a different language, wouldn't be a good tactic. As someone who is exposed to this culture, but doesn't have blue hair or takes themselves very seriously, this rhetoric feels right. I can see and understand where they're coming from. I know that's not a quantitative measuring of a metric, but sometimes you have to go with your gut. But Phineas sees hacking as a revolutionary tool, one that can be used to leak documents, expose wrongdoing, and yes, even rob banks, all from the comfort of one's own bed. We'll get to that in a future episode. They also quote the CNT, a Spanish anarchist trade union, who called for, quote, new forms of struggle. For Phineas, hacking is exactly that, a powerful new form of direct action. Now, taking a step back, the CNT is based in Spain, from what I know, and could be used to further collaborate the Spanish-speaking and thus add more detail about the person on keyboard. From there, the guide pivots to its main subjects, the Hacking Team breach itself. Phineas recounts that Hacking Team made its money by selling spyware to governments, who would then use it to monitor journalists, activists, political opponents, and other threats to their power. The CEO, David Vincennetti, even signed his email with the fascist slogan, Bola Chi Mola. Roughly, that means who gives up is a scoundrel. Now, I've also seen it can be translated to a bold way to say never give up. From speaking with an Italian friend, he said that most people would equate it to its negative roots these days, despite efforts to label it as a loaded term. But arguing over semantics of an Italian phrase isn't why we're here. And the Hacking Team CEO has alleged to do much worse. Like the first guide, I find these fascinating, both as a technical resource and window into the mind of one of the most notorious hacktivists we've seen. It's so rare to get insights from that side of the keyboard, and it's even more rare to do it repeatedly and not get caught. That's definitely not the norm. More on that later. However, there's also still holes left in the attack chain that were later filled in by Lorenzo Franceschi Bicchiari in a Motherboard article titled "Hacking Team Hacker Phineas Fisher Has Gotten Away with It." I'm going to use both the manifesto and the guide to piece it together. Now, as far as the operational side, the beginning OPSEC is largely the same as before. Use full disk encryption, keep your personal life and your legal life separate, use a VM, use Tor, VPNs, as well as hack servers. It helps if you have stolen Bitcoin as well. Additionally, Phineas discussed the infrastructure they use and why, similar to Gamma Group, the focus is to use Tor minimally, connecting to the attack infrastructure, and using faster, more stable servers for things that require multiple connections. Domain names used for CNC addresses and for DNS tunnels for guaranteed egress. Stable servers as command and control servers to receive connectback shells to launch attacks and to store the loot. And then hack servers as pivots to hide my IP address of the stable servers and for when I want a fast connection without pivoting, for example, to scan ports or scan the internet or download a database with SQL. I don't want to say this is common per se, but this does show a sign of maturity in the OPSEC. Phineas Fisher didn't mention it here, but another reason to do this is that with all these pivots, it can make the shelf life of an operation considerably longer. Now, if authorities have to track down the owners of each site, get warrants in different countries, and deal with the support team from multiple cloud providers, that all takes valuable time. Getting a warrant for a hacked server in the United States only to find that it was a pivot box to a server in Russia is a lot of work to only have to go back to the ISPs, cloud providers, etc. to get the IP on some sort of block list, because the Russian authorities didn't feel a need to do a speedy investigation or do anything at all. Now, going back to the manifesto, I want to highlight and quote the next section. Quote, "I didn't want to make the police work any easier by relating my hack of hacking team with other hacks that I've done or with other names I've used to my day-to-day work as a black hat hacker. So I use new servers and domain names, registered with emails, paid for with new Bitcoin addresses. Also, I only use tools that are publicly available or things that I wrote specifically for this attack. And I changed my way of doing some things to not leave my usual forensic footprint." End quote. Now, as a blue teamer, this is nails on a chalkboard or just pain. Now, this is a sign of someone who knows what they're doing, knows how the police will conduct investigations, and is aware of the forensic clues they left behind. It's not a one-for-one comparison, but this is kind of like those shoes from World War II, where the spies would walk around and make their footprints go in the opposite direction to fool the enemy. Stuff like this, and attackers being aware of it, makes attribution incredibly difficult. One of my favorite tools of the CTI detection engineer blue teamer is the David Bianco pyramid of pain. The idea is that behavioral indicators are near the top of the pyramid and thus should be targeted as indicators of compromise, as it makes it harder for the adversary/attacker to change them. It's hard to group, track, and attribute an attacker if they're always changing their tools, techniques, and procedures, TTPs. That is, unless they claim responsibility and just tell you in a text document. Phineas Fisher also gave time to throw some shade at state-backed APT groups. Quote, "In the news, we often see attacks traced back to government-backed hacking groups, APTs, because they repeatedly use the same tools, leave the same footprints, and even use the same infrastructure, domains, emails, etc. They're negligent because they can hack without legal consequences." End quote. Obviously, this isn't true for every APT group, but personally, I agree with this for the most part. Sometimes the A in APT, or Advanced Persistent Threat, is more of a compliment. Like the Gamma Group attack, Phineas goes into detail how they collect information, which is arguably the most important part, but adding to it was information gathered through social media, LinkedIn for employees, job postings about the software, and hints about operating systems that they use. One thing that stands out about Phineas that is kind of absent in today's world of ransomware arsonists and BEC actors is that they do their homework. We learned via the Motherboard article about the sealed documents from the Italian court that Phineas Fisher was in Hacking Team's network for something like 6 weeks. I'll touch on that timeline in a bit. But for a non-state-sponsored, non-intel agency, that is rare. Phineas apparently got 290 gigs of the 400 gigabyte total relatively early, but continued the campaign to get more. They had goals. This is potentially one of the things that Joseph Menn, or rather the government source in the book Cult of the Dead Cow, keyed in on to determine that Phineas Fisher was a Russian operation like Guccifer 2.0 or the Cyber Caliphate. What really needs to be investigated is if Lorenzo Franceschi Beccaria is really one person, or do they sleep? Because like everything else, Phineas Fisher, he's already got us the answers. In an article from Motherboard, vigilante hacker Phineas Fisher denies working for the Russian government. I've linked it in the show notes. We get Phineas's response. Quote, Phineas Fisher themselves, however, denied to Motherboard that he is a Russian government hacker, dismissing Menn's reporting as, quote, impressive mental gymnastics, end quote. Then quoting again, promoting a narrative with no evidence at all that I was acting for Russian interests and not public interests is irresponsible and dangerous for me. Phineas Fisher told Motherboard after reading the chapter that covers him in Menn's book, Cult of the Dead Cow, if I ever get arrested, it'll be pretty obvious that I'm not working for the Russian government, end quote as well. Like I said, my focus isn't on attribution either, but like this article points out, I think there's more evidence pointing away from this theory personally. The book came out in 2019, and I would imagine the research for it happened a few years prior. Probably wouldn't have been difficult to find some government official to remain anonymous and blame the Russians. Probably do that today. Now, I'm not trying to fault anyone, just trying to say that we need to be careful and not fall for Milgram experiments. Now, in an effort to not go down rabbit holes, I'll explain this briefly. The Milgram experiments were experiments in the 60s where Yale social psychologists basically got to see how willing people were to shock other people based on the recommendation of someone in authority, someone wearing a white coat. What they found was that 65% would go up to the full 450 volts, shocking this person on the other side of a glass. Obviously, this person wasn't getting shocked. They were just acting like they were getting shocked, but it was kind of terrifying to see that over half of the people would kill the person based on the recommendation of an expert. Now, there's some flaws in this as well. They also tried to link it to the Holocaust. If you want to look up more, just Google it or read the Wikipedia page. But the whole point in all of this is to say that experts get things wrong. This isn't new. This is why you get a second opinion or third opinion, fourth opinion, etc. And that's why it makes sense to vary where you get your information. Everyone is human. Everyone makes mistakes. And now that we're sufficiently off track, let's try to get back to the manifesto. Phineas Fisher then highlights the various ways on getting onto a network. You could exploit something public-facing, as they did with Gamma Group, social engineered or trick humans, or buy access from access brokers. Now, access brokers are teams or individuals that exploit systems inside of a network, think like a Fortune 500 company, then sell access to other crews. Those other crews could be like APT groups backed by a state, or criminal organizations, or in the extremely rare and sketchy, it could be a competitor of that business. However, in 2024, it's probably most likely going to be an APT group backed by a state, or a criminal organization, see ransomware arsonist. Hacking team was small, and thus that likely probably wasn't an option. So Phineas Fisher took the road less traveled. They had backdoored an edge device with custom firmware. Now, this is where myself and many others assumed that Phineas Fisher wasn't a lone wolf and was rather a team. So let's pull that thread a little bit. Generally speaking, people are good at modern exploit development aren't network operators or attackers. The skill sets don't match up one for one per se. Are there examples of both? Absolutely. Just not common. And as Phineas Fisher pointed out in the beginning, those people typically just sell exploits. It usually pays well. It's legal. You can still vacation to places with extradition treaties to the United States. However, Phineas answers all of our questions in a future manifesto that I'm going to get in a DeLorean right now and go 88 miles an hour so I can reveal it here. Quote, when I published my last DIY guide, I didn't reveal details of the sonic wall exploit that I used to hack Hacking Team, as it was quite useful for other attacks such as this one, which I'll talk about in a future episode. And I wasn't done having fun with it. Determined to hack Hacking Team, I spent weeks reverse engineering their model of sonic wall SSL VPN, and even managed to find several somewhat difficult to exploit memory corruption vulns, before I realized it was easily exploited with shell shock. When shell shock came out, many SonicWall devices were vulnerable, just as the request to CGI/bin/welcome with a payload and the user agent. Dell released a security advisory, but they missed a script called jarride.se, end quote. Now that I've returned from the future, I'll tell you what shell shock is real fast. Shell shock is a security vulnerability discovered in Unix in the bash shell in September of 2014 that allowed attackers to execute arbitrary commands on a vulnerable system by exploiting the way that bash processes environmental variables. This flaw can be exploited remotely if the system invokes bash through a network-facing service such as HTTP. This was kind of a big deal at the time. So once Phineas Fisher penetrated hacking team's network, they began internal recon, or as they call it, hunting sysadmins, which I think is a good name. First, they mapped and found the internal NoSQL database, dubbed No Authentication, and took a gander at what was inside. Mostly it was just audio files or webcam footage of hacking team devs spying on themselves with RCS inadvertently. After reading their documentation, Phineas discovered a misconfiguration in their iSCSI device that allowed them to mount the images and get some backups of the Exchange server and various other virtual machines. Pretty useful. Now, with those backups in hand, Phineas began scanning them for active accounts and the creds for those. They found an active account, BES admin, which was a local admin account. Now, with this valid local admin account, they did what everyone with the interpreter shell does next. They loaded Kiwi and Mimikatz those creds. Now, one of those creds was domain admin. Now, if you're an attacker in an Active Directory forest, you've won at this point. Now, Phineas Fisher also released all of those names and passwords. Posy, who people didn't really like anyway, used a super secure password of password, but this time the A, it was a 4. Phineas then proceeded to exfil data over proxy chains, like Hacking Team used to hide their comps, and even took a moment in the manifesto to teach the art of lateral movement in a Windows domain. I went over a lot of this in the Not Petty episode, as it's mostly just using psexec, WMI, PS remoting, and scheduled task, or the nuclear option, but also the most rewarding GPOs. As Phineas points out, you can just use the GPOs to turn on whatever method or protocol you want to use if it isn't enabled, or you can go super crazy and just push the payload via GPO as well, but it kind of gives you away. Next, Phineas Fisher tackled persistence, or how they approach persistence when hacking a company. I'll quote from the manifesto because it's absolutely hilarious. Quote, "Once you have access, you want to keep it. Really, persistence is only a challenge for a-holes like Hacking Team who target activists and other individuals. To hack companies, persistence isn't needed since companies never sleep. I always use the Doku 2 style of persistence, executing in RAM on a couple high uptime servers. On the off chance that they all reboot at the same time, I have passwords and a golden ticket as a backup access." You can read more about the different techniques for persistence in Windows here, and they list like a whole bunch of books. But for hacking companies, it's not needed, and it increases the risk of detection, end quote. Now, Doku 2 is a malware variant that jacked up some hotels. Maybe I'll do an episode on them in the future. Now, as a defender, I love when attackers establish persistence, and I find it. That being the caveat, of course. It's nice because it's a breadcrumb that they sort of have to leave. It's annoying because it's difficult to get rid of it all, and especially when it's time to evict them. Now, if you mess up, the keyboard commander on the other side knows that they're discovered, and they start trying to exercise their nuclear options. Now, back to the hunting sysadmins. Christian Posy, who everyone hated, as you remember, for lying on Twitter, also wasn't someone that Phineas admired either. Through reading the documentation, Phineas could see that they were missing something. The isolated network with the source code to RCS, the crown jewel of what Phineas Fisher was after. By keylogging on spying on Christian, Phineas Fisher found a Nagos server, which they mounted and spun up. And inside of it, they had a text file with passwords and access to the development network. From reading the emails, Phineas Fisher found out who gives access to the Git repo and reused their Windows dumped password on the server. Then they pivoted to the GitLab server, in which they used the forgot my password function and changed it since they had access to Exchange and everyone's email. Phineas Fisher concluded the manifesto with the following call to arms. Quote, "That's all it takes to take down a company and stop their human rights abuses. That's the beauty and asymmetry of hacking. With 100 hours of work, one person can undo years of work by a multi-million-dollar company. Hacking gives an underdog a chance to win and fight. Hacking guides often end with a disclaimer. This information is for educational purposes only. Be an ethical hacker. Don't attack systems you don't have permission to, etc., etc." I'll say the same, but with a more rebellious conception of ethical hacking. Leaking documents, expropriating money from banks, and working to secure the computers of ordinary people is ethical hacking. However, most people that call themselves ethical hackers just work to secure those who pay them the highest consulting fees, who are often the most deserving to be hacked. End quote. Ouch. So now you may be thinking, what happens next? Did Hacking Team come out and give all of their clients free credit monitoring for 2 years? Not exactly. The fallout from Phineas Fisher's devastating hack on Hacking Team in 2015 was swift and severe. Just days after the breach exposed the government's dealings with authoritarian regimes, the Italian government took action. In July 2015, Italy's Export Control Authority, it's an Italian name that I don't have the tongue to pronounce, revoked Hacking Team's global export license. This move effectively shut down their ability to sell their surveillance software to international clients. The government cited grave concerns about the potential misuse of these powerful tools by repressive governments to violate human rights and crush dissent. Maybe they saw Phineas Fisher's work. Hacking Team found themselves in an existential crisis. The lifeblood of their business, the ability to export their products, had been cut off. Desperate to get back in the good graces of the Italian regulators, the companies scrambled to make their cases heard. Through August 2015, Hacking Team engaged in a charm offensive. They were trying to change the way that they came off to the Italian government. They argued that their software was a critical asset for law enforcement and counterterrorism operations worldwide. The company made promises to strengthen their due diligence processes and ensure their tools would only be used for legitimate legal purposes by clients who respected civil liberties. By September, it seemed that their efforts had paid off, at least temporarily. Italian authorities agreed to restore Hacking Team's export license with the understanding that the company would operate under stricter oversight. The whole ordeal lasted about 3 months. Later in 2015, tools like RCS from Hacking Team and the PhineasFisher kit from Gamma Group got a new designation from the EU, dual use. Alex Hearn, in an article for The Guardian, said, quote, "The tortured mess of regulations around the provision and export of spyware means it's difficult to hold these companies to account, but slowly public opinion seems to be turning against them. In November, the new EU regulations meant that software like Hacking Team's RCS and Gamma Group's PhineasFisher became classified as dual-use good, one with a civilian and military application. It puts it in the same category as nuclear reactors and rocket fuel, and it means it will become significantly harder to legally export to repressive regimes." End quote. However, with Hacking Team, the damage to the reputation of the company was harder to repair. The leaked documents provide undeniable evidence of their willingness to cozy up to authoritarian regimes chasing money. Phineas Fisher's hack forced some much-needed sunlight onto the shadowy world of commercial spyware, and it was a wake-up call and a warning for other players in this space. In the wrong hands, these surveillance tools could easily be turned against innocent civilians, journalists, and activists. Democratic governments now had to reckon with how to effectively regulate this sector and prevent these tools from enabling human rights abuses. Sorta. This is still a murky topic. Mobile spyware is still around and being used all over the place. Now, this temporary ban may have been brief, but it sent shockwaves through the industry. It was a sign that companies like Hacking Team could no longer operate unchecked. There would be consequences for unethical practices and for empowering oppressive regimes, both from the governments in which these companies called home, activists like Citizen Lab, and possibly attackers like Phineas Fisher. Let's talk about some of those emails now. The media organization The Intercept published a piece of reporting titled a detailed look at Hacking Team's emails about its repressive clients by Core Courier and Morgan Marquis Bior. That may sound familiar, as Bior was a member of Citizen Lab and wrote numerous technical analyses of these tools. I used some of them earlier in the episode and with the Gamma Group episode. One thing that stood out to me when I was doing research for this episode, and was pointed out in this piece of reporting, was the Hacking Team took a different approach than most companies when selling morally ambiguous software. They openly claimed about their spying capabilities and often said it was better than the collection of that of PRISM or NSA's Section 702 program on metadata. That's a bold move. Of course, Hacking Team used the commercial spyware-approved messaging of we only sell these tools to governments and law enforcement agencies, which appear to be false. However, it's for up to those countries to determine the legal use of these tools, which could present problems, as you would imagine. The email showed that Citizen Lab started reporting on Bahrainians' PhineasFisher abuses, and that the Hacking Team field made jokes like, rumor has it, there's an opportunity in Bahrain. Then they proceeded to sell RCS to the Bahrainian Ministry of Defense from 2013 to 2015. So it looks like they kind of knew what their customers were doing with their software. And speaking of Citizen Lab, CEO David Ventinetti had an internal email where he stated, quote, activists working for a no-profit organization directing their efforts towards small possible foreign technology companies is easy. Directing their efforts towards local agencies is hard and risky. He wrote in another email, I have a question for you all. Please name a single really democratic country, a country which does not violate anyone's rights and has a total clean human rights record. End quote. Now, sure, it is easier for Citizen Lab to go after wrongdoing by Hacking Team and Gamma Group, Italian and German companies, rather than, say, abuses by the Canadian government. Sure, who knows? Maybe the Canadian government has significant funding into those programs. That could be tricky. Then there's the second email, and if you looked up the word perfectionist or nirvana fallacy, this email would appear. This is an attempt to say that a perfect solution doesn't exist, so therefore the entire concept is flawed. Think of it like throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Sure, we can agree that one way to make positive progress in the world is to not contribute to the negative aspects of the world. There was also evidence of talks with the Syrian government before the uprising against Bashar al-Assad. Then, out of character, Ventinetti felt the need to comment on a clientele with, quote, Syria is the most vicious, visible, and known by the public example of a dictator committing a protracted, never-ending manslaughter using ignoble tools, end quote. Maybe Syria was just late on their renewal. There was also an email conversation with the Ethiopian government and even internal communications where they juggled the bad publicity from the Ethiopian government's use of RCS with the $700K payday that they would receive. There were other abuses in Sudan and Morocco, all following the same theme that Phineas Fisher called out and that we discussed in the previous episode. These tools were being used to keep those in power, not help society, not solve crimes. These were used for human rights and privacy abuses. Ventinetti also lamented in emails with numerous call-outs about the journalists being biased and heavily influenced by other news themes like protect privacy at all costs. Ironically, they were upset when these emails were being released, though. On a serious note, I can see and understand some of this frustration. I don't agree with it, but I can see how some of the press they were getting appeared to be issues by their customers, despite them abiding by the guidelines of government customers and not on sanctioned lists. But they definitely capitalized on the conflict and sold to other unscrupulous customers. Definitely not without fault. There's something I brought up in the Not Petty episodes, and I want to express it again here. You don't have to agree with the person's motives or understandings of a situation to see their point of view. You can have empathy in their positions. Just because you acknowledge a thought pattern doesn't mean you hold it to be true. You just see it as a data point in your analysis, like the data point in response to Phineas Fisher's attack on Hacking Team. I think the nature of their business led to not many people caring that they got pwned. Kind of like how Russian authorities don't really pursue Russian attackers as long as they attack the West. Or in contrast, ransomwaring an oil refinery for the entire east coast of the United States got a lot of people's attention. Or attacking a children's hospital. That's how you get a lot of attention. And I don't think I would want to be caught and sentenced in the United States prisons on that charge. Inmates tend to have their own ways of dealing with crimes against kids. And I don't think this is a revolutionary idea by picking your targets correctly. It's what Phineas did extremely well. And back to Hacking Team. As I said earlier, sealed Italian court documents got leaked, and holes in Phineas Fisher's manifesto were filled in. Additionally, we got information about the ongoing investigation into the hunt for Phineas Fisher. The Hacking Team CEO, David Vincinetti, launched an all-out witch hunt that would make the Salem witch hunt of 1692 jealous. But it didn't take as long for people to see that these were all bogus. That's progress, people. Societal progress. Now, the court document revealed that previous employees were annoyed with Vincinetti as he was more concerned with profits than managing the infrastructure used to generate said profits, which to anyone in a tech business probably sounds familiar. Not calling out any business or anyone by name, just saying that, in general, this is kind of a common feeling amongst sex workers. Additionally, Vincinetti made accusations that his company was full of traitors and infidels. Sounds like a great place to work. Going so far as to name ex-employees who went to start another business as suspects. He even brought the receipts to prove it. However, the investigators were able to tell the difference between the source and destination IP on said receipts, which showed that it was Hacking Team accessing the other company's systems in Malta days after the Phineas Fisher attack to frame the ex-employee. Eventually, those charges were dropped, and Phineas commented on those actions with, quote, "I'm glad to hear that they stopped their pointless investigation that was mostly just being used as a tool by Vincinetti to harass ex-employees that he didn't like," end quote. And later on, Phineas continued with more thoughts on the investigation as a whole. Quote, "Maybe now the prosecutors will have time to investigate the various crimes committed by Hacking Team." Phineas Fisher told me recently, referring to the sale of the Hacking Team spyware in Sudan, the company's questionable hacking methods, and the sale to Mexican authorities, who then used it to target dissidents. But I don't have any illusions that the prosecutors will look any further into that. End quote. No word on if the Italian prosecutors did make any investigations. I think once they made the software dual use and more difficult to export, they probably just dusted off their hands and went about other things. Speaking of other things, Hacking Team rebranded though. In 2019, years after Phineas Fisher's attack, Hacking Team attempted to rise from the ashes like a mythical phoenix. The disgraced Italian surveillance firm found a lifeline in the form of Indepth, a Swiss-Italian company that acquired a majority stake in the business. The merger gave birth to a new entity called Memento Labs. Paolo Liezzo, the head of the rebranded venture, had his work cut out for him. Job 1, repairing the catastrophic reputational damage inflicted by the 2015 breach. Lizzie attempted to take on the issues head-on. He openly acknowledged that the long road ahead to rebuild trust, and that step 1 in the process was a complete overhaul of the Hacking Team's compromised products. The source code had been leaked. Leslie committed to rewriting the code from the ground up, a painstaking but necessary undertaking to fortify the company's offerings. Notably absent from the new leadership team was Hacking Team's controversial co-founder, David Vincinetti. The once prominent face of the company had been relegated to an informal advisory role, demotion, and speaks volumes about the post-hack power dynamics of the company. Vincinetti left a cryptic tweet signifying the end of Hacking Team. Quote, "Hacking Team is dead, definitely dead. I am not going to elaborate on that. I am not going to answer an inquiry about that. I do not use LinkedIn anymore, period. David Vincinetti." End quote. And with that, he kind of faded out of public view until 2023. Sadly, it wasn't for good reasons. Last year, he was arrested for the alleged stabbing and attempted murder of a relative that was taking care of him due to reported psychological issues. That's extremely sad. Now, back to Memento Labs. Leslie had ambitious goals for Memento Labs. He aimed to have the company firing on all cylinders in time for the following year's ISS World Conference in Prague, a marquee event for the surveillance industry. Beyond the product reboot, Lizzie hoped to retain Hacking Team's existing client base, albeit with a pledge to adhere to stringent export rules and revoke the licenses of any customer caught violating human rights. Though Memento Labs had no delusional about dethroning the market heavyweight NSO Group, Leslie saw an opening for the retooled firm to carve out a niche, leaning on Italian ingenuity and expertise. NSO Group being the maker of Pegasus, like I've stated a few times already. One intriguing footnote in the Memento Labs saga is the anonymous Saudi investor who scooped up a 20% stake in the venture. Curiously, Leslie confessed in the report that they had never met this silent partner, and they offered little in the way of detail about their involvement, an open question that added to the air of intrigue about the company's fresh start, considering their earlier efforts to sell to the Saudis. Now, Memento's lab struggled to get off the ground, as most of the devs moved on, probably to NSO Group, and NSO Group altogether had become the de facto market leader of this. And let's wrap up this portion with the FBI making an arrest in the case. Remember those stolen Bitcoins I keep talking about? Well, the FBI was able to track down who purchased them in a bizarre and unfortunate twist. The owner's name was John Da Vinci, the unwitting accomplice to Phineas Fisher's grand hacking team operation. You see, Da Vinci was just your average American minding his own business with this Bitcoin scratch-off card site, like everyone has, right? As like their side hustle. That and drop shipping, of course. Little did he know, the hard-earned Bitcoins were about to take a wild ride. Phineas Fisher, probably knowing that law enforcement were developing ways to track Bitcoins, or just being frugal, decided that the best way to fund their infrastructure against hacking team was to liberate some Bitcoins. And where better to get them than from the Buy Bitcoins website with the codes stored in the back-end database. So Phineas Fisher apparently got into the Buy Bitcoin site database and helped themselves to some of Da Vinci's cash. Fast forward a bit, and suddenly Da Vinci just got the FBI knocking on his door, warrant in his hand, ready to confiscate every electronic device he owns. The poor guy had no idea what was going on. He had never heard of hacking team. He didn't even know who Phineas Fisher was or anything like that. That's a rough way to learn something new. That's why you should just listen to this podcast so you don't have to learn that way. It turns out the Italian authorities had gotten wind of the Bitcoin shenanigans and decided Da Vinci must be in cahoots with Phineas Fisher. They even tried to get an arrest warrant, but the U.S. State Department luckily stepped in. It looks like the misunderstanding was resolved, but nevertheless adds an element to the curious case of Phineas Fisher. Now, as we close this chapter on Phineas Fisher and hacking team, we are left to ponder the impact of one individual's actions on a global scale. The attack not only disrupted a company, but also sparked a worldwide conversation about surveillance, privacy, and human rights, one that's still going on today. There's a book by Byron Tao called Means of Control that goes deep into how the U.S. government is buying buttloads, that's a scientific term, of consumer data to spy on people without a warrant. I've included a link to a political art interview with Tao. However, the book is well written and worth a read in my opinion. But I think this quote sums up the core issue. Quote, the tipster told Tao that the government was buying up reams of consumer data, information scraped from cell phones, social media profiles, and internet ad exchanges, and other open sources, and deployed it for often clandestine purposes, like law enforcement and national security in the United States abroad. The places you go, the websites you visit, the opinions you post, all collected and legally sold to the federal government. End quote. Now, laying my cards on the table as I'm a human with an opinion and thus bias, but I don't think this should be legal, especially for U.S. citizens and that thing called the Fourth Amendment. At the very least, there should be some standalone banner or something notifying the consumer outside of the 400 pages of terms and service that this information could be sold to the government to monitor you. I think that may drive subscription costs if you could opt out of that. I think that the U.S. government is cool and all, and maybe it's because I'm an American and culturally I'm not really okay with someone being in my business without cause, but it all feels odd, and I'm a naturally suspicious person. Now, I'm not advocating for hacktivism or for people to go do things that are illegal, highly illegal, in order for you to get famous or to raise awareness to a cause. Furthermore, the work of organizations like Citizen Lab and Amnesty International in highlighting these acts of oppression and abuse are valuable, but only to those who read the reports, follow the groups, or listen to podcasts that discuss this type of thing. Carrying out an attack on one of these companies, while illegal, dangerous, and certainly not the right message we should be wanting to send, brings the incident to the forefront in a different light. In other words, not many organizations, especially media organizations, would have hacking team on their radar without them being the victim of this attack, the hack, the dumping of their emails. Which ultimately leads to the question, why did hacking team get hacked? Which ultimately could lead to a more discovery and more enlightenment by people reading Citizen Lab reports. Full transparency, I doubt I would have covered the abuses of mobile malware so soon had it not been for the actions of Phineas Fisher. I didn't know about Citizen Lab, Amnesty International, or really Vice Motherboard until I heard about this on an episode of Risky Business. The good one with Patrick Gray and Adam Boileau, not that stupid Nate Silver one where I guess they couldn't even Google the name before trying to launch it. And I would have probably started with Pegasus from NSO Group, not Gamma Group or Hacking Team. I'll have a future episode on Pegasus. But in a world where technology often operates behind closed doors, this story is a powerful reminder of the need for vigilance and ethical scrutiny. And while this didn't kill Hacking Team immediately or mobile malware overnight, it did put Hacking Team in a death spiral. The business is no longer around, but it didn't kill the demand for this type of software. Unfortunately, I doubt this was Phineas Fisher's plan, but they may have cleared the competition for the newly venture-backed, aka well-funded, NSO Group to swallow up the competition. Maybe Phineas Fisher was an 8200 op.
Plot twist.
I'm kidding. I doubt that's true. That would be some super 4D chess right there, and Phineas appears to be sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. And with that, I think this is a good place to end this episode. Next time, we will discuss the Turkey AKP email release and when Phineas Fisher robbed a bank. Yes, you heard that correctly. Robbed a bank. 2016 was a busy year for Phineas Fisher. If you would like to hear more, please visit the website intrusionsindepth.com, where you'll find more stories on high-profile intrusions and the threat actors that conduct them. I'm Josh Stepp. Thanks for listening.